Chapter 5. At 6 o'clock on the same morning of the mysterious robbery at the Buntings, Mr. and Mrs. Hall discovered that the bolts on the front door of the inn had been slid back and that the door was slightly open. "I locked the door last night before we went to bed," said Mrs. Hall. "Who could have possibly—" "Who else?" said her husband, pointing up to the stranger's room. "Let's go check." As they hurried up the stairs, Mr. Hall heard a cough coming from somewhere and thought it was from his wife in front of him. Mrs. Hall heard the same cough and believed it was from her husband behind her. At the top of the stairs, they knocked at the door but got no reply. "Try the door," said Mrs. Hall. Mr. Hall turned the knob and the door opened easily. "There's no one in the bed and no one in the room either," he whispered to his wife. But Mrs. Hall was staring in amazement at the big armchair near the fireplace. "Look," she gasped. "There's his coat and trousers and shoes and eyeglasses on the chair, and his hat's hanging on top of the bedpost. And there on the table, all his bandages are piled up in a heap," added her husband. "His clothes are here, but he's not. This is all a very curious business," said Mrs. Hall, going over to the bed. She put her hand on the pillow, then under the covers, and announced, "They're all cold, so he's been out of bed for an hour or more." Just then, a most extraordinary thing happened. The blankets and sheets gathered themselves together, leaped up into a peak, then jumped over the foot of the bed onto the floor. It was followed by the stranger's hat, hopping off the bedpost and whirling through the air into Mrs. Hall's face. The next moment they heard a bitter laugh in front of them. The armchair turned itself on its side and flung the stranger's coat, trousers, shoes, and glasses to the floor. The chair seemed to be propelling its four legs through the air, charging at Mrs. Hall. The innkeeper screamed and whirled around to her husband behind her. The chair slowed slightly and came to rest against her back. Then it pushed the two out of the room. The door slammed violently and the lock snapped shut. Then everything was still. Mrs. Hall fell against her husband almost in a faint. "It's evil spirits, I swear." "Now calm down, Jenny," he said. "There's got to be an explanation. Come downstairs." Once Mrs. Hall had a cup of tea to steady her nerves, she told her husband, "George, we've got to lock him out. He's put evil spirits into the furniture in his room." "What about my room?" boomed the muffled voice coming down the staircase. It was the bandaged stranger glaring angrily at them from behind his large blue glasses. "You have no business in my room. Stay out and leave me alone." With that, he stormed back up the stairs and slammed his door shut. We were just up in his room and he wasn't there," gasped Mrs. Hall. "How could he come down?" Her puzzled husband just shook his head, and for the next 6 hours no one went near the stranger's room. Mrs. Hall even refused to answer his bell when the man rang it. "I suppose he wants food," she told her husband angrily. "But he can go to the devil." By noon the usual customers had gathered at the bar. Everyone was talking about the mysterious robbery at the Reverend's house. The conversation came to a sudden halt when the stranger, in his hat, gloves, and long coat, walked into the bar. He glared at Mrs. Hall and demanded, "Why didn't you serve me my breakfast? And why haven't you answered my bell?" "Why haven't you paid your bill?" she snapped back. "It's been 5 days since I gave it to you." "I told you I didn't have the money then, but was expecting it in the mail any day," he replied angrily. "Well, no money, no food, no room." The stranger seemed to realize he was at the woman's mercy, and his voice softened as he added politely, "But I do have it now." "Oh? And where'd you suddenly get it?" she demanded, remembering the talk at the bar about the Bunting robbery that morning. "And you've also got some explaining to do about my furniture. What did you do to my chair upstairs? And how do you get into your room when we found it empty at 6 o'clock this morning? Guests of my inn come and go by the doors, and you—" Suddenly the stranger raised his gloved hands and stomped his foot. "Stop!" he shouted angrily. Mrs. Hull backed away and became silent. "You don't understand who I am or what I am," he said with an eerie calmness. "But by heaven, I'll show you." He put his hand in front of his face, then withdrew it. The center of his face where his nose had been was nothing but a black hole. "Here," he said, placing something soft and rubbery in Mrs. Hull's hand. The woman looked down at her open palm. When she saw what that something was, she staggered back against the bar and dropped it to the floor, shrieking, "It's his nose! He's taken off his nose!" The stranger ignored her and the gasps and cries from the villagers at the bar. His gloved hand then removed his hat and pulled off his eyeglasses. With a violent gesture, he tore off his long whiskers and patches of hair, then began unwinding the bandages from his head. The horrified villagers backed away in terror. They could hardly believe what they were seeing. They were prepared to see some scars, to see a disfigured face, to see some kind of atrocity. But no one was prepared to see nothing. Mrs. Hull screamed hysterically as she darted away from the bar and flew towards the door. Everyone in the room followed, tumbling over each other in panic. The only man who remained inside the coach and horses was a figure dressed in trousers, gloves, and a coat with a turned-up collar. But above that collar was nothing. Nothing at all.